On paper, 2025 was supposed to be a year of solidarity. In reality, it became the year the humanitarian system quietly broke, not with an explosion, but with budget lines erased, websites going dark, food rations cut in half. While the world watched wars unfold on their screens, life-saving aid slipped into recession. Not because suffering declined, but because the money did. Here's the uncomfortable truth. In 2025, global needs stayed brutally high, yet aid collapsed to levels last seen nearly a decade ago. More people hungry, fewer people helped. This wasn't an accident. It was a political decision repeated across capitals, accelerating faster than anyone expected. And the consequences were immediate. Children ate less, aid workers died more, famine returned to the global vocabulary. If you care about how power actually works in the world, not in speeches, but in outcomes, stay with me. Because to understand how this happened, we need to step back and look at the system itself. And that story begins long before 2025. For decades, humanitarian aid has been sold as a moral reflex. A crisis erupts, the world responds. Money flows, lives are saved. But that story hides something important. Aid is not automatic. It is a system built on budgets, politics, trust, and timing. By 2025, that system was under extreme strain. Conflicts were multiplying, climate shocks were overlapping, food prices stayed high, displacement surged, and yet the machinery designed to respond was shrinking. Governments didn't deny the suffering. They simply recalculated their priorities. Austerity replaced ambition. Short-term politics beat long-term responsibility. At the same time, expectations grew. Aid agencies were asked to do more, reach farther, move faster, protect workers in deadlier environments. With less money and less patience from donors, this is the central contradiction of 2025. Humanitarian need became more complex, more dangerous, and more expensive. Just as the willingness to pay for it began to disappear. To see why that contradiction proved fatal, we need to rewind. Back to the forces that reshaped humanitarian aid long before the crash. The pressure did not arrive overnight. It built slowly, year by year, crisis by crisis. Between 2019 and 2022, the humanitarian system absorbed two historic shocks. First, a global pandemic that froze economies and shattered supply chains. Then, a full-scale war in Ukraine that redefined geopolitical priorities. The cost of responding to human suffering nearly doubled. Appeals ballooned. Logistics became harder. Security risks intensified. For a brief moment, governments stepped up. Funding surged. In 2022, global humanitarian contributions reached a record peak. But that surge masked a deeper fragility. Much of the increase was reactive, not structural, emergency money, not long-term commitment. When new crises erupted in Gaza, in Sudan, across the Sahel, the system stretched again. This time, donors hesitated. Inflation bit at home, political capital thinned, public attention splintered. By late 2024, the warning signs were clear. Budgets tightened, programs quietly scaled back. Aid agencies began preparing for contraction. The system had survived shocks before. What it hadn't faced was what came next. A rupture at the very top, and that rupture would turn strain into collapse. The break came fast, and it came from the one donor the system could not afford to lose. In January 2025, the United States pulled the emergency brake. An executive order froze new foreign aid. Days later, stop work orders spread across active programs. Within weeks, the world's largest humanitarian machine stalled. Projects didn't wind down. They stopped mid-delivery, mid-crisis. Clinics closed without notice. Food pipelines snapped. Aid workers were told to stand down in places where standing down meant starvation. For years, the United States had carried close to 40% of global humanitarian funding. Others complained about the imbalance, but everyone relied on it. When that pillar cracked, there was no backup. No surge fund waiting in reserve. No coalition ready to absorb the shock. Governments watched. Some sympathized. Few compensated. This was not a policy tweak. It was a systemic shock, one that exposed how dependent global solidarity really was on a single political decision. If you think this was just about one country pulling back, keep watching, because the real damage wasn't the cut itself. It was what the cut revealed about everything underneath. What lay beneath was a fragile illusion. That humanitarian aid had diversified, that risk was spread, that private money could step in when governments stepped away. In reality, none of that held. When public funding collapsed, private finance barely moved. Pledges were announced, press releases circulated, but the money did not arrive. In 2025, more than 60 governments still found hundreds of millions for emergency response. The private sector contributed a fraction of that. Single-digit millions, some still listed as promises. Aid agencies had planned for volatility. They had not planned for absence. With no cushion, they cut inward. Staff were laid off, operations consolidated, life-saving programs were triaged. Food from the hungry was redirected to the starving, not because it was humane, but because there was nothing else left to cut. At the same time, danger escalated. Aid workers were no longer collateral victims. They were targets, and increasingly, those targets were chosen by states themselves. To understand how this turned a funding crisis into a moral one, we need to confront what 2025 did to the people on the front lines. By 2025, the consequences were no longer abstract. They had faces, names, and funerals. That year, more aid workers were killed in 6 months than in any full year on record before 2023. This was not random violence. It was patterned, and it was escalating. For the first time, state actors overtook militias as the leading threat to humanitarian staff. In places meant to be protected by international law, that law stopped protecting anyone. Nowhere was this clearer than Gaza. More than 500 aid workers killed since October 2023. Convoys struck, shelters hit, medical staff buried alongside patients. When those responsible for upholding humanitarian norms become the primary violators, the system doesn't bend, it breaks. Agencies pulled back, access narrowed, neutrality lost its meaning. Aid work became a calculation of acceptable deaths, not among civilians, but among those trying to help them. And while this violence shocked the world, its impact was felt most quietly by people who never saw a headline. To understand that cost, we need to shift the focus away from institutions toward you. Imagine depending on aid not as support, but as survival. Imagine knowing that if a truck doesn't arrive this month, you don't eat. In 2025, that was reality for millions. And when funding collapsed, the consequences landed on people like you first. In refugee camps, food rations were cut quietly. No announcements, just smaller portions. Then skipped meals. Parents ate less so their children could eat at all. Children stopped growing. Some never recovered. In places like Gaza, Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, and Bangladesh, aid wasn't a buffer anymore. It was the last line. And that line snapped. Hunger at this scale doesn't just weaken bodies. It damages brains. It shortens lives before they are fully lived. If you're listening to this from a place of safety, this matters to you more than you think. Because humanitarian collapse doesn't stay contained. It spreads through instability, through displacement, through resentment. If this story makes you uncomfortable, it should, because it's not about distant suffering. It's about what kind of world we are quietly accepting. And the ripple effects don't stop there. What happened next was predictable, and yet still ignored. When aid collapses in one place, pressure doesn't vanish. It moves. Food shortages drive displacement. Displacement strains borders. Strained borders harden politics. By late 2025, humanitarian failure had become a geopolitical accelerant. Refugee flows increased across regions already tense. Host countries absorbed costs they were never prepared to carry. In the Middle East, hunger fed instability. In Africa, aid gaps deepened, conflict cycles. In Europe and Asia, migration fears reshaped elections. This is the paradox of humanitarian aid. When it works, it's invisible. When it fails, it rewrites global politics. Even security suffered. Starvation weakened fragile ceasefires, desperation empowered armed groups. Aid vacuums became recruitment zones. What began as budget decisions inside ministries ended as strategic liabilities. Not just moral failures, but self-inflicted risks. The international system learned too late that neglect travels faster than compassion. And now, facing the wreckage, the world stands at a crossroads. Because what happens next is not inevitable. It depends on which future we choose. There are three paths forward. None of them are comfortable. All of them are possible. The first is recovery. Governments reverse course. Funding stabilizes. Aid systems modernize without abandoning their core mission. Private capital finally complements, not replaces, public responsibility. This path doesn't erase the damage, but it stops the bleeding. The second is stagnation. Aid limps along at reduced capacity. Crises are managed, not prevented. Famine becomes cyclical. Emergency response turns permanent. The system survives, but hollowed out, reactive, and increasingly normalized in failure. The third path is collapse. Cuts deepen. Violence against aid workers continues unchecked. States ignore humanitarian law without consequence. Aid becomes selective, politicized, and conditional. Millions fall outside the system entirely. This isn't a moral thought experiment. We are already moving between these paths at once. The future of humanitarian aid won't be decided by speeches. It will be decided by budgets, by enforcement, by whether power accepts responsibility for the consequences it creates. And that leaves us with one final question. What happens when the world decides not to decide at all? By the end of 2025, one illusion was gone. That humanitarian aid is guaranteed. That someone, somewhere, will always step in. What this year proved is harsher. Aid exists only as long as power chooses to fund it. And when that choice disappears, so do the safety nets millions depend on. The Great Aid Recession wasn't caused by lack of knowledge or lack of capacity. It was caused by withdrawal. Budgets were cut, responsibility was deferred, and suffering was treated as a distant externality. This is the real danger ahead. Not one bad year, but the normalization of abandonment. A world where famine returns not because we cannot prevent it, but because we decide not to. If this system is allowed to fail quietly, it will be rebuilt differently. More political, more selective, less humane. So the question is not whether humanitarian aid survives. It's what kind of aid survives and who gets left out. If you want to understand how power, money, and human survival intersect in the years ahead, stay with this channel. Share this story. Because silence is not neutral. And in the world we are entering, it is already choosing a side.